We're an area under siege because in-town living is popular and nobody wants to sit on 400 for 6 hours anymore, and so everybody wants to move into town, but they don't want to live in what's there. They want to tear that down and build something else. Well, before I start talking about Camp Glisson, I wanted to give you just a little bit of history about the area, which I find fascinating. If you know Forest Service 42, which is accessible from the end of Waseca Road and also from Black Mountain Road, if you go up there far enough, you'll come to Cane Creek Gap, and that's where Cane Creek starts. It's a spring that bubbles up out of the ground, and it goes underground and keeps going, and then it starts flowing more and more, and then it's joined by several other tributaries, I think Little Cane Creek and West Cane Creek, before it gets to Camp Glisson, where you have the wonderful 30 to 35-foot waterfall, which is a beautiful photo on the cover of Jack Anthony's waterfall book, is Cane Creek Falls. Before Camp Glisson was even thought of, the Etowah Indians, Native Americans, lived there north of the falls in a settlement about 1,200 years ago. And there was a guy named Dr. John Worth at Fernbank and Dr. Dennis Blanton, who looked at some of my artifacts and determined that these were Etowah artifacts by the designs on them, and they thought for years and years that the Etowah stayed over near Nakuji Gap and at Etowah Mounds, but now we know, we have evidence right here that they were in this area, and we know that they came over in seasonal hunting parties. And the evidence is the pottery that I'll show you in a minute. The Cherokees came later, about 800 years ago, and then we had the gold rush people, the miners, who came out to Cane Creek Falls to mine for gold, but unfortunately, as I tell people most every weekend that I'm here, there's no gold there because we're not in the gold belt. Many of you know from Ann Anderson's wonderful books on I Remember Dahlonega that there was a water wheel at Camp Glisson. And that's a fascinating story. I'm going to get to Camp Glisson itself in a minute, but the water wheel is important to me because I live around the corner from Preston Arkwright's home, which is a palatial Druid Hills Tudor mansion of, I think, 28,000 square feet or something outrageous. But before that, there was a water wheel between 1921 and 1935 that Robert Hauser brought over. The train came to Gainesville, and then he got the train pieces of the water wheel, 8 sections from Brookton, Georgia, and it was taken on metal drays, especially arranged to haul it, 8 horses per dray, and it was taken over to Cane Creek Falls and set up. And there's all kinds of wonderful pictures. I think you have a picture in the book of the Hauser wheel, right? Don't you have one? And if you're standing by it, the person is about that big, because the water wheel was about 40 feet tall. And it was the largest overshot water wheel east of the Mississippi. At some point, Georgia Power, because Preston Arkwright, president of Georgia Power, went to North Georgia College, as it was called then, bought the falls because he was extremely interested in hydroelectric power, and he thought that that was the power of the future. He also encouraged the Atlantans in 1913 to build a subway or underground, and he was laughed out of the hall, and if we had done that, things would be very different. He's very much of a person who, a visionary, and he saw the future. He thought that that water wheels and hydroelectric power was the way of the future, and that's why he wanted to buy Cane Creek Falls, which he bought. In 1942, however, that water wheel was dismantled during the war. It was sold for scrap metal to help with the war effort. Now, for many years, the Dahlonega Chamber of Commerce owned 2 acres out there at Camp Glisson. Not the waterfall, and not right around the waterfall, but more along, if you know where the chapel is or the dining hall, that area, about 2 acres, and there were cottages out there that you could rent and go out and go trout fishing or to spend some time in the woods. And if you go out and look around the Camp Glisson chapel, especially on the creek side or the left side of the chapel, you will see some ruins of those cottages that the Chamber of Commerce built. Then, at some point in 1924, some big wigs of the Methodist Church were sent around looking for a place for what was called then Summer Assembly. It was being held at Oxford College and at Reinhardt. And it was called the Epworth League, and it was a youth group that later became MYF, Methodist Youth Fellowship. And so some folks came out to Camp Glisson and saw that it was really, really beautiful, and I don't know why the chamber decided to rent it to the camp, but they did. And so that was the beginnings of Camp Glisson, although it was not called Camp Glisson till later. This was in 1925, the first camp. And my grandfather was a student, a cadet at North Georgia College in 1913 and through 1915, and then later went to Washington, D.C. for school and then to World War I. But in the meantime, he told me stories about what it was like out there. And one of the rites of passage for cadets then was to slide down Tancred Falls. Fortunately, my grandfather survived or I wouldn't be here. I don't know if he really did that or if that story is apocryphal. I do know there have been people that have gone over the falls safely and people who have not gone over safely, and I know that at least one person has taken a kayak over the falls. So, we're moving on to Ma and Pa Barton, who were some of the early Methodists that were very involved in youth work. You have to kind of remember what the Methodist Church was into: missionary work, winning souls for Jesus Christ, and peace efforts, and then also anti-alcohol, and sort of a world connection so that you knew people from other countries. And that's important because Ma Barton was very instrumental in bringing a lot of foreign students to meet those of us in this country, especially Koreans, and missionaries that she would train and send over to other countries such as Japan, Russia, Korea. And that continued, at least up until my lifetime of being a counselor. We had a foreign student each year, and it was wonderful because at that day, my high school didn't even have black kids, and the only foreign student we had was Robbie Wong, who was Chinese American. So we didn't have a way to get to those people. Then Mr. Glisson came. Mr. Glisson was an interesting character. Fred Glisson, he was orphaned. His mother died. He didn't like his stepmother. When he was 5 years old, he ran away and found a place to live with a family in Macon. And they took him in, and he began studying bees. And throughout his whole life, he raised bees. He had hives on Lanier Boulevard in Atlanta. He had hives behind his cabin at Glisson. And when he was 12 years old, he had business cards made that said, Bee Specialist Fred Glisson. And that's how he paid for Vanderbilt University. And even into his 70s, people in downtown Atlanta, back when the windows were still open, would call him to get bees out of office buildings. And he would get them out. Fascinating guy. I knew him personally, and I could spend 2 hours talking about Fred Glisson, but I'm going to keep going. Fred Glisson came to Glisson 2 years after it was formed. That was in 1927. He later was a minister at Inman Park Methodist and was chaplain for Emory Hospital in Clifton. Now, I mentioned that Mr. Arkwright was a student at North Georgia College, and when he was president of Georgia Power, he bought the Falls, and the way he became president of Georgia Power was that H.M. Atkinson, who was the president of Georgia Power, and he has Plant Atkinson named for him, also the first president of the Druid Hills Golf Club. All these guys knew each other. Mr. Atkinson was told he had to sign a whole stack of stock certificates, and he was the president. He had to sign them, and he said, "I don't want to do it." And Mr. Arkwright was a lawyer who was married to the governor's daughter. Pretty good, step up for him. And he said, "Well, you've got to sign them." And Atkins said, "No, I don't want to do it. You be president." And that's how Arkwright became president of Georgia Power, and the railway, and the gas company, and the railway company. So Arkwright was a very rich and important person and a visionary, and I really admire some of the stuff he did. However, in his huge mansion, Heimling, which is right around the corner from my house, he wasn't so trusting about whether gas light or electric light would really win out in the end. So he had his house on the main floor wired for both gas lights and electric lights. But anyway, enough on Mr. Arkwright. There had been a move to get the falls from the Georgia Power Company for years and years. Mr. Glisson had been visiting with Mr. Arkwright for 15 years. Mr. Arkwright was on his deathbed, his final illness at Emory Hospital in Clifton, and he finally said, you know, Mr. Glisson, you have been trying to get these falls for me for 15 years, and you can have them for $1,500. And that included 2 acres of land. So you can imagine what those falls would cost today if you could even buy them. Now, Mr. Glisson was one of the first cabin owners, and there was no money from the Methodists to support Camp Glisson. So he thought, well, here's what I'll do. I've got a bunch of buddies in the Methodist Church. I will sell lots to them for $50 a piece, which back in the 1930s and 40s was a lot of money. And that's how my family ended up with a lot in a cabin at Camp Glisson, because Mr. Glisson sold it for $50, and another family built our log house there. So he did that, and then he had all these powerful people, including Waits Henry, who was later president of LaGrange College, and John Tate, and Sidney Tate, and others. And they were out there, and they owned property, and of course they were going to give money to Camp Glisson. So it was a brilliant move on Mr. Glisson's part. Back in the 50s, moving a little forward, they built a new dining hall to replace a wooden shack, which was the original dining hall. They built a new chapel. Bishop Arthur Moore came on July 4th, 1951 to dedicate that building and the Rock Chapel. And it's said that workers who did some of the work on Unicoi, and I'm looking at this rock work, some of the work on Unicoi and at Wallacea Center, up where AT crosses at Mills Gap, that they did the rock work out there for the dining hall and the chapel. The architect was a guy named Wallace G. Neal. Those were the most beautiful buildings he ever built. Everything else he built was really pretty ugly. Most of that's been torn down. Then the old rec hall, which dates from 45, is a big barn-like shaker structure, which several of us fought very long and hard in the camp because we wanted to tear it down. It was old, and why not tear it down? Anyway, we won. And then there were cabins for the campers built in the 40s, late 40s, and those are all gone now too. They were not particularly handsome, so I didn't have to fight them over that. Back in that day, Camp Glisson was only used in the summer, and it was closed down the rest of the time. There was a Native American Cherokee caretaker named Clarence Yother who lived there with his many children and wife, and they called Camp Glisson a leadership training center. But they named it Camp Glisson because Fred Glisson had done so much to help get the camp going. Now, I'll pass this around to you now. I kind of got out of sequence. These are the markings that Dr. Worth and Dr. Blanton decided were authentic Etowah markings, and they're on my pottery. And I'll pass this around. If you see these, each Etowah piece of pottery tends to have a different design. Now, just going back to I'll pass this around too, going back to the artifacts, all of these, plus lots more that I don't have with me, have been found below Pancrook Falls, and that's because the Moore family off of John Moore Road plowed their field for many years, and when they plowed it and the creek flooded, these would wash over the falls, and my brothers and I would pick them up. So what you have here are arrowheads, bird points, and pottery. The pottery's here, and you can see the designs. The black and the red is obsidian rock. It's not found in Lumpkin County. It's not found anywhere near here. So we figured they traded for it, or they brought it in, and they made their arrowheads. The quartz that you see is from around here. So anything that you see that's gray, reddish colored, or black is from somewhere else. The bird points, which were Cherokee on here, tiny little pieces. And these were more spear points. And the spear points were used by the Native Americans to throw at the game. And we think that all the Native Americans had bows and arrows. That was the Cherokee. The Etowahs did not have bows and arrows. So back to Camp Glisson, I mentioned that they were training. They hoped to train leaders to be in the local church. They were anti-alcohol. They were anti-premarital sex. And they were interested in witnessing to others and also getting people to sign up to be missionaries. So some of the classes that they held out there for the youth in the summer included alcohol awareness, communism, Christian witnessing, our part in world peace, and boy-girl relations. I'm not sure what that is. By
Well, that was a major feature of the camp.
Boy-girl relations, I can speak a lot about that in my day. In 1953, a railroad engineer on the old Southern Railway donated a locomotive bell from a steam engine. It's still out there, and it's used to ring and call people to meals and to other activities. By 1957, Camp Glisson was really getting more liberal. They allowed boys to smoke in the bathhouse only, but they did not allow girls to smoke. In the early days, the water...
But you did anyway.
You did anyway, I know that. I used to hide behind my cabin with a guy named Ned Bridges. Anyway, Camp Glisson's water came from a spring located down on Cane Creek, and you had to go down there with your bucket and get that water. The water for toilets and showers was pumped right out of the street, out of the creek, and if it wasn't raining, it was pretty clear, but probably not as clear as tap water. And if it was raining, it was really muddy. And everybody at Glisson was warned, do not drink the water from the tap, because that's for washing dishes. Do not drink the toilet water, do not drink the shower water, because all that's coming out of the creek. And the spring water was the only thing used for cooking and also for drinking purposes. Well, the time came when Camp Glisson needed a water system. So Cumming, our neighbors down the road, had a water system up for sale, and we bought their water tank and their filtration system. And we had the best and highest rated water in the state of Georgia up until about 10 years ago. What happened? The federal government came and said, you can't do that water anymore because it's not automated. Our water plant had beautiful, wonderful, fresh tasting water. It was so good, and we were told we could not do that anymore because we needed a computerized water system, and that was going to be expensive, so we went on city water at that point. Oh well. The first full-time manager was a guy named Reverend Jack Nelson. You may have remembered later that he was there in the 50s, but later on he became rather famous temporarily because his wife and daughter were kidnapped from the parsonage in Jonesboro and held for ransom. Everyone was fine. And also back in that day, Cane Creek, and you can look up some old topo maps and see this, Cane Creek, instead of having a straight shot down by what's called the Holland Gym, went down this far, then did a dog leg, turned left, and went at the bottom of the mountain over here. And at that dog leg, trees and debris would form, and the creek would flood and wash everything away. So Reverend Nelson and others made the creek a straight shot, and for a long time it looked awful, but now it looks normal. You can't tell that it wasn't always that way. In the 1960s, Camp Glisson began to winterize its building so that they could hold programs year-round. And a group, the camp that I actually taught at for so many years was called then Pioneer Camp. And that's where you cook over a fire, you chop wood, you get up at 6 in the morning, you learn how to use an axe, you chop your wood, you build your fire. Everything is done with no electricity and no power tools, and it was the happiest time of my life, I think. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience to both be a camper, live in a tent out in the woods for 3 months, or to be a counselor, and just magnificent. I mentioned I was just in D.C. and I saw both the Holocaust Museum and a thing called the Museum, which I encourage you to see if you're ever up there. It's fabulous. It's fabulous. And they have some civil rights history there. And John Lewis is my congressman, and he is an old friend, and he was on one of those buses in the 60s that was turned over and set afire, and he was beat up. So when you think about Camp Glisson in 1962, with 2 or maybe 3 counties near us, namely Dawson and Forsyth, that didn't allow black people, like individuals, to be in their county overnight, to think that Camp Glisson would hold a race relations weekend. And I see the picture of the Greyhound turned over with the flames coming out, and they were going to go through Cumming, and then because of the way 19 went, they were going to go through Dawsonville. And the word got out that there were lots of people, Clemson and so forth, who would not allow the buses to pass to Camp Glisson. The two people in charge of this, Dr. Harry Richardson from Atlanta University and Dr. Dal Kirkpatrick from St. Mark Methodist, both are deceased now, both were very active in civil rights. And the camp got the word that race relation weekend better not happen because there's going to be trouble. And the buses would be stopped and would not be allowed to come through. So what they did is put the white kids on the trailways and send them through Forsyth County and Dawson County. And Methodist ministers were engaged to drive black kids to the conference up underneath blankets in the back of the car, and the black kids all made it. Well, once they got there, and the people that were so unhappy about this, they decided that they had foiled their plan to stop it, but now it was going on. They were going to storm the camp, and they were going to come in, and I have no idea what their plan was, but I'm sure it was not going to have a positive outcome. And Jack Nelson and others parked every vehicle that they could, tractors, pickup trucks, dump trucks, regular cars and trucks. They parked it all up at the gate to block the gate. And the fallback plan was to go down to the Holland Line, which is like a gym, and to hole up in there if the Klan actually did come through. So they came out to the camp and realized that the camp was pretty fortified, and it was not going to be as easy to get in and disrupt the program as they thought. So they left, and there was no incident, which I find amazing and I'm grateful for. However, after the race relations weekend ended, on Sunday in April of '62, they did come out and burn a cross at the falls, and I was, I think 11 or 12 years old at the time, and I remember it, and it was really scary. And there were guys in the Klan regalia out there burning the cross. Move ahead to my mentor, Bob Cagle, who came to Glisson in 1968. He was from LJ, Georgia, and a visionary when it came to camping and outdoor living skills. And he taught me everything I know about living in the woods and wildflowers and trees and environmental issues, which we were talking about at Glisson back in the 60s. Maybe not global warming, but some of the stuff about conservation and composting and those kinds of things which are important today. And we added so many new camps back then. We added more pioneer camps. We added Appalachian Trail, canoeing, kayaking, horseback riding, so many outdoor programs. Because during Bob Cagle's tenure, even though he was a bona fide Methodist minister, he was also one of the leading people in the United States in camping, and later became the head of camping for the entire Methodist Church throughout the U.S. And so just to even have Bob as a mentor and a teacher was extraordinary when he was at Glisson. And he was there all the years that I worked there. And one year that I didn't work there because I was trying to get out of college. I couldn't keep on goofing off in the woods all the time. And then Bob went on to Oregon, and then he went on to being the head of the camping in the Methodist Church. And new people came, and a swimming pool was built because we heard that the falls were contaminated with poultry waste, and that back in that day people would just dump their motor oil above falls and dump whatever animal waste, whatever, they would dump it in, and it really was nasty, and we could not let kids swim in that water anymore. So they built the swimming pool. Since that time, Trout Unlimited and other groups have helped us clean up. And I wouldn't drink the water, but I have no problem swimming in it and fishing in it. But back then, we had to have a pool, and that was '69. And lots more programs were added. There was a local guy who died about, I want to say 3 years ago, Reverend Bob Lanford, who was at Glisson, and he was also a camping enthusiast. He helped to add land and programs and more backpacking, canoeing, kayaking, and horse camps to the camp curriculum. When Bob Cagle and Bob Lanford were there, the emphasis was on outdoor living skills and appreciating God's beauty in the outdoors. Earlier and later, it was more geared towards reading the Bible, witnessing for Christ, getting people to join the Methodist Church and be missionaries. So you have sort of Camp Glisson going in and out of real emphasis on religion versus camping, and now we're kind of at a happy medium where it's a lot of both. And also during the 80s, I just heard this in the news, somebody suing the Methodist Church over Simpson Wood. Mrs. Ludy Simpson was a woman who owned, or her family owned, this huge amount of land out on the Chattahoochee. It's worth a fortune today because it's surrounded with subdivisions. She tried to give it to the Presbyterian Church, but they wanted to sell it, and she wanted it to remain intact as a place and not be developed. And so the Presbyterians were turned down, and the Methodists accepted it. And the only stipulation was that it be kept together, not be developed, and that they build a chapel in memory of Mrs. Simpson's mother, and they did that. Simpson Wood became the focus for the Methodist Church. They raised a lot of money for Simpson Wood, and Camp Glisson was the redheaded stepchild. We were in a mess in the 80s. We had no money. The Methodists were not really willing to give us much of anything. Most of what we did was what they say, a smile and a shoe shine, to quote Arthur Miller. I mean, we just were trying to get through. During that time, Bob Blanford were there, but it was a time of terrible financial crisis. A lot of buildings deteriorated because the Methodists were looking at Simpson Wood as the be-all and end-all. And I even hate to say this, but the Wesley Center and Camp Wesley, the Methodist Center on Ralph McGill, the Wesley Camp, which was a black camp, and Camp Glisson were all very close to being sold. Bob Blanford personally stopped Camp Glisson from being sold. And now we find out that Simpson Wood didn't really work out the way they hoped, and thank goodness we still have Camp Glisson. So moving on up to 1994, and I was reading in the Lumpkin County Nugget that the Palm Sunday tornadoes are almost 10 years. Our 10-year anniversary on that is coming up, and that was a very scary day in Lumpkin County. And I was here, and I was at Camp Glisson in a cabin that's probably not as good as a mobile home in a tornado. And I looked outside, and I thought the dark gray shutters on the cabin were closed. And then I thought, wait a minute, they're not closed, that's the sky. And somebody said, run, and we all began to run and took cover. And Camp Glisson suffered some damage. No one was hurt there, but we lost some buildings. And then I went over to a friend's house where my horse was boarded and got into more tornadoes over there and spent some time in the crawl space, which was pretty scary. But that stands out in my memory as being a very hard time in Lumpkin County and at Camp Glisson, because we lost so much. We lost so many trees out there, and we lost some buildings, and other buildings were damaged. Some of our backcountry trail shelters were just gone, and all the trees were tin and roofing and children's toys and strollers. It took us a long time to get all of that out of the trees. Not long after that, however, or actually before that time, Bob Cagle had come back to Camp Glisson, having left his job as the camping director for the whole U.S. Methodist Church. And I was on the board then, and we were doing so many incredible things, just unbelievable things. And Bob met with a very tragic accident out at the camp. And I say this with chagrin because Bob taught me everything I know about camping safety. And he got all over me one time and just rang my chimes because I was carrying an axe in an unsafe manner. You know, you have the two fingers on the blade. What happened to Bob, and there were lots of rumors about it, what happened to Bob was that he had a gun that belonged to his father, and he was going to get some topo maps because he was going to lead a trip. And the gun was inside of its case, canvas or leather, I'm not sure what, and it fell. And even though he thought it was unloaded, there was still, it was a defective gun and there was a shell in it. It hit, it went off, it shot him in the chest, he was killed instantly. Oh. And so the irony for me was a man who taught me so much about safety would be killed in such a bizarre way. And those of us who were there at the time met with the coroner, and I can't remember his name now, and the sheriff, because a death like that, they have to come out and investigate. It was at his home. And I remember the coroner saying it's like a 1 in 10 billion chance that this could have happened. that all these things could have happened in this way, and I was just, I still am not over that completely. We had some help from the Methodist Church who brought in people to help us get through that summer, because Bob died on April 21st, and we were facing camp beginning at the end of May, so we needed to scramble. And so we had help from the Methodist headquarters in Atlanta, and eventually we got a new director, and then we have another switch back to more emphasis on religion and less about the camping. Bob's gone, and now we have more of the religious stuff going on. But also during that time, a lot of things happened. They built a high and low elements course on some of the mountains. That was for team building, and they would take kids out and they would learn to trust each other and help each other. And then Bradley McIntyre, who's now the director of Camp Glisson, and an old friend of mine and a friend of Bob's, he was trained by Bob Cagle. Bradley brought in an alpine tower, which is, I don't even know how tall it is. It's real tall, but you climb up it, and you help, and different people do different things to help you get up there. And I think I got out of sequence here for a second because I forgot to mention Sparrowwood, which was something that Bob Lanford was very instrumental in. Sparrowwood is our camp for mildly to moderately intellectually challenged campers, and they are mainstreamed. They have their own building, and they have a greater ratio than, say, if I'm a counselor, I might have 6 campers. At Sparrowwood, I think it's 1 counselor for every 2 campers. And the same kids have been coming as long as I can remember. I think one kid's been coming for 30 years. He's not a kid anymore, he's in his 40s or 50s. The purpose of the camp is to give the parents respite and to show handicapped children that they can do a lot of stuff, like climb the Alpine Tower and use the ropes course. But more important than that, it's a time when normal, quote unquote, able-bodied, intellectually fine campers do stuff with these kids and learn to be tolerant and learn to understand what having a handicap is. It's a fabulous program and a model really in the United States, and not many people really know about it. We don't serve as many kids as we want to because we don't have the room and the money. But that program is out there, and they have their own building, and they do everything that the normal campers, quote unquote normal campers do, with a few exceptions. And they are part of everything, and it's wonderful to see. Now I'm going to wind up and then have some time for questions and a couple of other things. Since Bradley's come back, we've added some other things. We have a zip line, which is terrifying. I won't get on it. It goes from way over here to way over there. Kids love it. And our old water tank that I mentioned that we bought from Cumming, when we went on the city water supply, we had this big water tank, and it was going to cost, I don't know, $25,000 or something to move the tank off the property. And so Bradley came up with the idea of putting, making it into a climbing wall. So now we have this water tank up there that kids climb up with all the safety equipment, and it's great fun, and I'm not going to do that either. I'm afraid of heights. And they have a lot more emphasis on the kayaking and canoeing. They have a lot of leadership training going on for high school seniors that want to go on and do leadership roles either at the camp or in other places. They have a lot more emphasis on rustic camping, taking kids out for 2 weeks on the AT, backpacking. And they have these new camps that are day camp satellites, so that a church, say in Gainesville, might have a day camp run by Camp Glisson people. Maybe the kids are too young or they can't come over here to the facility, but our people go over there to them, and that's been really successful. In memory of Bob Cagle, they built a big thing, Garland Reynolds of Gainesville designed. It's called we call it the Stamp Mill, but it's called the Bob Cagle Center as well. And that's a meeting center. It's named in memory of Bob. And we have Ivy Lodge, which local Dahlonega resident Russell Ivy and his wife funded for us, and that's a place where people can sleep. And we have a new swimming pool because the average life of a swimming pool is 30 years, and ours was built in '69, so do the math. We got a new pool, and we'll soon have a new dining hall because the old rock dining hall is cannot house everyone who needs to eat at one time. I have mixed emotions about that. I'm really, really glad they're not going to tear down the old rock dining hall, and it will be used, and there'll still be kids singing on the front porch. But it's also sad to me, too, that it's not going to be used in the way that it was, because I have memories since I was 4 of that dining hall. I'm hoping that I can convince them to put both the chapel, the rec hall, and the dining hall to apply to get them on the National Register. I don't know how far we'll get with that, we'll see. Right now, the camp happens in the summer, and I don't know what will happen when, say, Atlanta, DeKalb County, Fulton County goes to year-round education. I don't know what we'll do, but we'll figure it out. And they have retreat groups on weekends. There's a group coming tomorrow night at 7, 300 people out there. And then other times during the rest of the year, they rent the facility to non-Methodist groups. If you want to have a leadership training event, use the Alpine Tower, come and have a retreat for your group, you can rent all that stuff out there. I was just trying to think about growing up at Camp Glisson, because we spent every summer here from the time I was 4 until now, and I'm not going to tell you how long that is. One of the things that I think you should congratulate yourselves for is really Dahlonega, the town, doesn't look that different. And you can imagine what it would have looked like had all that been torn down. There's one building that I remember where I think it's one of the new antique malls. There used to be an old wooden building, and that's gone. But most of the square, with the exception of the fact that new shops are in there instead of Moore's grocery store, and instead of the what was that other place? Well, I remember the Lodestone, and I remember when the courthouse was actually the courthouse. But all of that is still there. And if this were Atlanta, it would be gone. Believe me, it would be gone, and there'd be Lowe's and Home Depot and a zillion McDonald's around the square. And so thank you for keeping this a good place. We're seeing some encroachment come in, on the edges, but I think people want to fight to keep the downtown the way it is. We have had some fights at Glisson about keeping, about many things, about keeping our historic buildings, repairing and making people aware of the environment and not trashing the waterfall or trashing the creek. We have strict penalties now for people that throw their trash down or throw their trash in the creek. And we have some pretty strict rules about what you can do down at the falls, and it's catch and release, which it didn't used to be, and I'm sorry for that. But you can fish for trout as long as you throw them back. Growing up at Glisson, it was a magical place, and Dahlonega, oh gosh, Dahlonega was a magical place. People talked funny, coming from Atlanta. Youans, weans, and theyans, remember that? Does anybody here remember that? And thar, come hither and go thither, and all that. It was almost Elizabethan. And since the 400's been built, that's all, of course, gone away. But everybody knew everybody, and the square was a real place where you went to shop. You went grocery shopping or you went to the drugstore. It wasn't what I call the cutesy shops, the shops where you buy souvenirs and stuff like that. But at least it's still there. And I have to admit that I grew up at Glisson thinking that every child in America had their own waterfall. What a shock to find out later that just isn't true. My brother is older than I am, and he also worked at Glisson and was a counselor there forever. And I guess the 4th generation of my family to go to camp, or maybe 5th, was my nephew. And my brother's ill. He has Parkinson's disease, and he lives in Virginia. But he wanted to come to Georgia, to the cabin, and we took him down to the falls and got him comfortable in a chair, sitting in the water, and he just sat there, and he just looked at it. And I thought, this is worth everything, that this place is so magical and so wonderful for me and for my family. Now I'm going to stop. See if you have any questions before we have to end. Yes, sir.
I've lived here for 9 years, and either I picked the wrong time, but I've yet to get on the Glisson grounds. Am I going there in the winter time, or am I going there when it's open, only certain people are going to rent a facility? How is it possible that I can take a look at this great facility you've talked about?
Okay. Camp Glisson is open pretty much during the week for the public. It's open, you just go to the Welcome Center, which is right before you get to the gate, and you sign in. And they will tell you how to either walk or drive down to the waterfall. It's harder to get in during summer camp. One of the unfortunate changes that's happened in my lifetime is, more crimes against children, and you're very aware of that. And for the most part, everybody, when I'm out there doing volunteer work, I will see people come in and I'll greet them and say, go on down to the falls. I would say go during the winter, during the week, or go during the summer on weekends, because that's when the counselors and the kids are gone.
Okay.
Another point, which is a sore point with the camp, is that when Mr. Arkwright sold the falls, he made two stipulations. Being a good Georgia Power executive, he said nobody can ever again have a power plant at Kangaroo Falls. End of discussion. And he had written on the deed, this property will never be sold, but he did sell it to Mr. Glisson. The other stipulation, because it was a watering hole, a fishing hole, a swimming hole, a picnic ground for the people who lived and grew up here in Lumpkin County and around Dahlonega, he wanted it to remain open to the public. And for the most part, the camp adheres to that. But when they have kids out there, they don't allow the public in. Other questions? Go out and see the falls. They're unbelievable. It's one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the state.
You brought some of your books to sell?
I did. I'll hold this one up. This is a 75-year history, 1925 to 2000. I'm working on the sequel, which is will be 2000 to whenever I finish it. This took 12 years. And I went all over the United States interviewing people for this that had been part of Camp Glisson. I started with the old timers, and by the time I finished 12 years later, most of them had gone. Most of them were dead. So if you're going to write a history, start with old people and finish up with young people. It was wonderful. I remember being in Arlington, Virginia, with these people who had been at Camp Glisson in the 40s, and they started singing, and they were the same songs that I knew from having been out there. So that whole continuity just kept going. But I do have some books if anybody wants to buy one. It's a great history. It has more history. It has more history of Lumpkin County and some other things other than just the camp. And there's a lot of people that you may recognize names. And any other questions before I halt? Well, thank you, and please have me back to talk about the challenges of historic preservation in the city of 6 million people.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I recognize it, yes, Price Memorial Hall, right? Okay. Oh, my grandfather was, when he was at the college, he was a student in a white frame building, it was never torn down. Does anybody know about that?
Is that Barnes, white frame building, which was the barracks for the cadets?
Yeah, he lived in a white
No, it was a
frame.
barracks.
Is it Barnes?
No, that's the old building is buried behind that one.
Right here?
Well, that may be it. No, let's see. No, I think that's the old first dormitory building there. I guess maybe the barracks, so you can go.
I went with my grandfather to visit Daddy Barnes when I was about 10 years old, and Daddy Barnes was living at the Smith house. So, I mean, that's how far back. Daddy Barnes was an inspiration to my grandfather, who lived to be 99. Thank you so much.
That's a limited edition print.
Oh, yeah, great. It's going in my cabin. If anyone wants a Holy Dirt book, I'll be glad to sign it for you. They look like this, and it's a great history of just not only Camp Glisson, but I didn't tell you why it's called this. Can I do that real quickly? Bishop Arthur J. Moore, one of the more famous of the Methodist bishops, was from South Georgia, and his camp was Epworth by the Sea, which is on St. Simon's. And in one of their lean times, they brought him up to Camp Glisson, and they took him all around, showing him everything, trying to get him to give him some money. And he was pretty disgusted. He figured out what they were doing. And he said, well, the way you all are acting about this camp, it's like you think it's some kind of holy dirt. So that's become our mantra. Yeah, that's where holy dirt comes from. But if you want one, let me know. Thanks for your hospitality.
As was mentioned earlier, next month will be our annual awards night, and that will be on Thursday.